The year was 1850, and the Smoky Mountains breathed like a living creature. Morning fog slid slowly through the valleys, thick and silver, curling around ancient trees whose roots gripped the earth like clenched fists. The mountains rose layer upon layer, their blue-gray ridges fading into the distance, hiding what lay beyond. To most men, this wilderness was beautiful but cruel, a place where one mistake could mean death. To him, it was something else entirely. It was shelter, it was silence, it was freedom hard-earned and fiercely protected. He moved through the forest without sound, his bare feet knowing every root, every stone, every patch of damp moss. The leaves did not crack beneath him, and branches never snapped to announce his presence. Years ago, when he first fled into these mountains, his body had been weak from hunger and chains. His hands had been soft from forced labor in the fields, his mind heavy with fear. Now his muscles were carved by cold winters and endless climbing. His hands were rough and scarred, shaped by knives, traps, and fire. The mountains had remade him, piece by piece, into something the lowlands could no longer recognize or claim. He had once belonged to a plantation far from here, where the air was thick with heat, and the smell of sweat and blood clung to everything. There, days began before sunrise, and ended long after the sky went dark. Names were stripped away and replaced with orders. Pain was routine, and hope was dangerous. When he escaped, running under a moonless sky with dogs barking somewhere behind him, he did not know if he would live another hour. All he knew was that dying free was better than living owned. The mountains had loomed ahead like a wall, dark and endless, and he ran toward them without looking back. At first, survival was desperation. He ate roots that made his stomach twist, berries he prayed were not poisonous, and whatever small animals he could catch with clumsy snares. Rain soaked him for days, and winter nearly took his life. But slowly, painfully, he learned. He watched how animals moved, where they drank, where they hid when storms came. He listened to the wind, understanding when it warned of coming cold or heavy snow. The forest became his teacher, stern but fair. Every lesson was costly, but every lesson kept him alive. By 1850, the Smoky Mountains no longer felt like an enemy. They were a map written in scent, sound, and shadow, a map only he could read. He knew which slopes held warmth even in winter, which streams stayed unfrozen, and which caves remained hidden from wandering eyes. He built shelters that vanished into the land, roofs woven from branches and leaves so perfectly that even hunters could pass within steps and never see them. Smoke from his fires was thin and carefully timed, rising only when the fog was thick enough to hide it. The fog was his ally. It wrapped the mountains in secrecy, blurring shapes and swallowing distance. Men who did not understand it became disoriented, their sense of direction unraveling as easily as thread. He learned to walk straight through it, guided by memory and instinct. Where others saw nothing, he saw paths, faint bends in the land, subtle shifts in the trees, the way sound carried differently near cliffs or open ground. In fog, he became nearly invisible. Hunters often came to these mountains, drawn by stories of rich game and untouched land. They came with rifles, steel traps, and loud confidence. They spoke too much, laughed too easily, and believed the forest was something to be conquered. From a distance, he watched them, always unseen. He learned their habits quickly. Hunters followed predictable patterns. They trusted maps that did not change, and trails that shifted with every season. They believed strength lay in weapons, not understanding. Whispers began to move among those who traveled the edges of the Smoky Mountains. Some spoke of a shadow that seemed to follow hunting parties, of traps that failed or vanished, of food stolen without tracks left behind. Others claimed they felt eyes on them, a presence that made the hair on their necks rise. Few believed these stories fully, but enough did to pass them along. Fear, he knew, could be as powerful as any blade. He did not seek to become a legend. Survival demanded silence, not attention. But fear kept people away, and distance meant safety. The more mysterious he seemed, the less likely anyone would search too hard for him. In a world that saw him as property, becoming a ghost was a kind of victory. No chains could bind a man no one could catch. Still, danger never fully left. Slave catchers sometimes crept into the mountains, following rumors and rewards promised on faded posters nailed to tavern walls. They believed that every man could be tracked, every trail followed. They underestimated the mountains and the man who had become part of them. When such men entered his territory, he observed them carefully. He learned their routes, their camps, their weaknesses. Often they left frustrated and empty-handed. Convinced they had chased nothing more than a myth, the forest itself seemed to protect him. Storms would rise suddenly, washing away tracks. Trees would fall across paths after heavy winds, forcing strangers to turn back. Animals would scatter, leaving hunters hungry and impatient. To those who did not understand the land, it felt cursed. To him, it felt like belonging. As dawn broke over the Smoky Mountains, pale light filtered through layers of fog and leaves. Birds stirred, cautious and quiet. He crouched on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, his eyes scanning for movement. From here, he could see trails that others could not, faint lines where the earth had been disturbed, branches bent the wrong way, the subtle signs of men entering his world. Today, something felt different. The air carried a tension he recognized, a warning that trouble was approaching. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Fear still lived within him, but it no longer ruled him. The mountains had taught him patience, and patience had kept him alive. Whatever was coming, he would not meet it blindly. He would observe, wait, and choose his moment. In these mountains, haste was death, and silence was strength. Somewhere far below, unseen by him for now, men would soon step onto paths they believed were empty. They would think they were entering a wilderness untouched by human hands. They would not know that every stone, every shadow, every breath of fog already belonged to someone else. And as the Smoky Mountains held their secrets close, the mountain man moved like a whisper through the trees, ready to defend the only freedom he had ever truly known. The men entered the Smoky Mountains with confidence heavy in their steps and arrogance riding on their voices. They were not amateurs or nervous boys chasing stories. They were seasoned hunters who had tracked deer through frozen valleys and bear through dense thickets. Their rifles were well oiled, their boots thick, their belts heavy with knives, rope, and iron traps. To them, the mountains were nothing more than another challenge to be mastered. They believed the land would bend as it always had before, to men who carried guns and experience. They spoke openly as they climbed higher, their laughter echoing off the slopes, careless and loud. One of them carried a folded paper tucked into his coat, a CR. Ewed map marked with trails and notations passed down from others who had hunted these mountains before. Another spoke of the reward rumored to be offered for the capture of a runaway slave said to live somewhere in the Smokies. Gold, he claimed, or at least enough money to make the risk worthwhile. The others listened with interest, their eyes sharpening at the thought. To them, the man was not a human being, but an opportunity. From the shadows of the trees, unseen and unheard, he watched them arrive. He observed first always. Observation was survival. He counted them quietly, noting their sizes, their movements, the way they carried their weapons. He saw which man took the lead and which lagged behind. He noticed the slight limp in one hunter's stride, and the way another favored his right hand when lifting his rifle. These details mattered. In the mountains, knowledge was more valuable than strength. The hunters began laying traps almost immediately, confident in their skill. They set iron jaws along narrow paths, staked rope snares near streams, and marked trees with shallow cuts to guide their return. They believed themselves clever, believing the land was a puzzle they could solve with enough mettle and patience. What they did not understand was that every trap they set was an announcement. The scent of disturbed earth, the unnatural alignment of branches, the sharp smell of iron. All of it spoke loudly to someone who knew how to listen. He moved after them, his pace unhurried, his presence erased as soon as he passed. He examined each trap carefully without touching it at first, memorizing its placement, its purpose, and the thinking behind it. These men relied on force and tools. They lacked imagination. They did not consider that the land itself could be turned against them. As the day stretched on, the hunters pressed deeper into the mountains following rails that faded with every step. They trusted their map, unaware that streams had shifted and fallen trees had reshaped the land since the map was drawn. He had watched these changes over years, learning how the mountains breathed and moved. Where the hunters saw confusion, he saw opportunity. They camped near a stream as dusk approached, building a fire without concern for smoke or visibility. Their conversation drifted through the trees, carried easily by the cooling air. They spoke of the mountain slave with mocking tones, dismissing him as half wild, half lucky. One man joked that he would drag the runaway down by a rope like a deer carcass. Laughter followed, sharp and careless. From his hidden vantage point, anger stirred deep within him, but he did not act on it. Rage was dangerous. It made men foolish. He had learned long ago that survival required control. Instead, he listened. They revealed their plans freely, unaware they were being studied. At dawn, they intended to split into pairs, circling the higher ridges while leaving traps behind to funnel their prey. They believed the mountains would do the work for them. Night settled heavily over the Smoky Mountains. Fog crept in low and thick, wrapping the trees and swallowing the firelight until it became nothing more than a faint glow. The hunters settled into uneasy sleep. Their confidence dimmed but not extinguished. One kept watch, pacing near the fire, rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. He yawned often, scanning shadows he could not see through. The mountain man waited until the fog deepened, until sound softened and distance became meaningless. Then he moved. He approached the camp from downwind, his steps guided by memory rather than sight. He did not go close enough to be seen. He did not need to. Instead, he studied the ground around the camp, noting how the hunters had positioned themselves. Where their gear lay scattered, where they had grown careless. With slow precision, he shifted small things. A boot turned slightly. A bag moved just enough to be noticed. Subtle changes that would plant doubt when morning came. Before dawn, he began his real work. One by one, he returned to the traps the hunters had set earlier that day. He did not disarm them outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he altered them. A snare meant to pull upward was rerouted to yank sideways. A pit trap was deepened on one side and camouflaged unevenly, so a man stepping in would fall awkwardly, likely breaking an ankle. A falling log trap was adjusted so its release point would trigger sooner than expected. These traps had been built with assumptions about weight, height, direction. He changed those assumptions. He knew how men moved when tired, when confident, when afraid. He reshaped the traps to punish those habits. As the hunters stirred with the first light of morning, the mountains seemed quiet, almost peaceful. Birds called cautiously. Mist clung to everything, blurring outlines and swallowing sound. The men broke camp with practiced ease, unaware that their night had been shared with something far more patient than they were. They split into pairs just as they had planned. This pleased him. Separation bred confusion. Confusion led to mistakes. He followed the pair moving along the narrow ridge trail, staying just far enough back to remain unseen. Their boots crushed leaves and snapped twigs, their breathing loud in the still air. One man boasted about how close they must be getting, convinced the silence meant success. The other nodded, though his eyes darted nervously into the fog. The first mistake came quickly. A sudden shout echoed through the trees as one of the men stumbled forward, his leg caught in a snare that yanked sideways with brutal force. He crashed to the ground, screaming as the rope tightened around his ankle. The trap had not killed him, but it had injured him badly. Panic flooded his voice as he clawed at the rope. His companion rushed to help, not noticing the uneven ground until too late. His foot slid into the edge of the altered pit trap, and he fell hard, his body twisting unnaturally as he hit the bottom. The sound of bone striking rock carried faintly through the fog. From the shadows above, the mountain man watched without satisfaction or cruelty. This was not revenge. It was necessity. He did not approach them. He did not reveal himself. He let the mountains and the men's own tools do the work. Elsewhere in the forest, confusion spread. Another pair heard the distant cries and rushed toward the sound, abandoning caution. In their haste, they triggered a falling log trap that smashed down with terrifying force, narrowly missing one man and crushing the rifle of another. Fear replaced confidence in their eyes. Shouts echoed, directions contradicted, and the fog thickened as if responding to the chaos. The hunters called out to each other, but their voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mountains distorted sound, turning allies into ghosts. He moved constantly, always above or behind them, never staying long in one place. He left signs just obvious enough to be noticed. A broken branch here, a footprint there. leading the hunters in circles. They followed desperately, believing they were closing in, when in truth they were being guided into exhaustion and fear. By midday, the hunters were no longer hunters. They were lost men, wounded and frightened, stumbling through a landscape that refused to make sense. Their traps had turned against them. Their confidence had dissolved into panic, and still, they never saw him. High on a ridge, the mountain man paused. Lee. Stenning to the echoes of their confusion fade into the forest. He knew the outcome now. The mountains had spoken, and the men had finally begun to listen. Whether they would survive, their retreat was no longer his concern. His freedom remained intact, written into every mist-covered tree, and every silent path they could no longer find. Night did not fall gently in the Smoky Mountains. It arrived in layers, thickening the shadows and pressing down on the land, until even familiar shapes seemed strange. The fog returned with the evening cold, sliding through the trees and pooling in the low places like a living thing. What little order remained among the hunters dissolved as daylight faded. They no longer moved with purpose or confidence. Each step was cautious, uncertain, haunted by the memory of screams and sudden pain. The injured men were slowing the group, and resentment crept into their voices. One hunter cursed the mountains, another blamed the traps, and a third muttered that they were being followed. The idea of an unseen presence unsettled them far more than any visible threat. Every snapped twig made them flinch. Every shadow felt intentional. They had come here believing they were masters of the wild, but now the forest watched them in silence, patient and unyielding. He stayed close, though never close enough to be sensed. He understood the power of fear intimately. Fear made men careless, but it also made them loud. Their breathing grew heavy, their arguments sharper. He could track them easily now, even without looking. The sound of their boots scraping stone and leaf carried through the fog like a trail of bells. They were no longer hunters. They were wounded animals moving blindly through unfamiliar territory. The hunters attempted to regroup near a rocky outcrop as darkness deepened, believing higher ground would give them safety. They lit another fir. Smaller than the last. But even that small flame felt like a reckless gamble. The fog swallowed most of its light, leaving only a dim orange glow that barely reached the surrounding trees. Their faces looked hollow in the flicker, eyes wide and restless. One man suggested turning back immediately, abandoning the hunt entirely. Another argued that retreat in the dark would be suicide. Tension rose, words turned sharp, and the unity that had once bound them fractured further. They were tired, hungry, and afraid. The mountains fed on such weakness. From above, hidden among rocks and twisted roots, he watched them argue. He felt no triumph, only focus. He had learned long ago that survival did not come from emotion but from clarity. The night was his ally. Darkness stripped men of certainty and left them exposed. When the fire burned low and exhaustion forced them into uneasy rest, he began to move again. He circled their camp slowly, careful to stay downwind. He scattered pebbles near the edge of the firelight, just enough to make a soft sound when kicked. A hunter stirred, gripping his rifle tighter, eyes scanning the fog. Nothing appeared. Silence returned, thicker than before. Doubt took root. Later, he snapped a branch farther out, letting the sound echo briefly before fading. Another man sat up, heart pounding. They whispered to each other, arguing over what they had heard. Was it an animal? Was it one of their own? Or was it something else entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at them. He did not need to attack. He only needed to be felt. As the hours passed, nerves frayed. One hunter wandered from the camp to relieve himself, rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. He took only a few steps before the ground shifted beneath him. The altered pit trap claimed him instantly. His shout was sharp and brief, cut short by the shock of the fall. The camp erupted in char. Us! The remaining men rushed toward the sound, shouting his name, forgetting caution in their panic. In their haste, one tripped over a rope snare and crashed face first into the ground. Another stumbled into a cluster of low-hanging branches that concealed sharpened stakes meant to funnel animals. The traps were doing what they had been designed to do, just not to the creatures their creators had intended. He watched from the darkness, his expression unreadable. Each movement he made was calculated, each step measured. He did not linger long enough to be traced. The fog hid him, the night protected him, and the men's fear blinded them. The hunters' voices grew frantic now, overlapping and disorganized. They called out warnings that came too late, shouted directions that led nowhere. The fire was abandoned as they tried to pull their injured companions free. Blood darkened the earth, and pain echoed through the trees. At one point, a hunter fired his rifle blindly into the fog, the shot exploding through the mountains like thunder. The sound rolled across the ridges and returned distorted, multiplied. Panic surged, more shots followed, each one increasing their terror rather than easing it. The mountains answered with silence. Gunfire was a language he understood well. It meant men were afraid enough to abandon reason. He knew now that the hunt was over. What remained was escape. He began guiding them, not toward him, but away. He left clearer signs now, more obvious disturbances in the brush that pointed toward a narrow ravine. To them, it looked like a path, a way out. In truth, it was a place the mountain itself controlled. Loose stone, sudden drops, and twisting passages made it treacherous even in daylight. Desperation pushed them forward. They followed the false trail eagerly, helping the injured as best they could, driven by the belief that movement meant survival. Their breathing was ragged, their steps uneven. Fear narrowed their vision until all they could see was the ground directly in front of them. The ravine swallowed them whole. One man slipped on loose gravel and slid hard against a rock wall, his shoulder cracking with a sound that echoed briefly before being absorbed by fog. Another lost his footing and tumbled several feet, narrowly avoiding a fatal drop. The group slowed further, their energy draining with every step. From above, he watched as the mountains finished what fear had started. He felt no guilt. These men had come to capture him, to drag him back into chains. They had brought violence into his refuge. The land was simply responding. As the night deepened, the hunters finally stopped, too exhausted to continue. They huddled together in the narrow ravine, shivering, wounded, and broken in spirit. Their rifles lay forgotten at their feet. They no longer spoke of rewards or pride. They spoke only of getting out alive. High above them, hidden in shadow, the mountain man listened. The fog curled around him, cool and familiar. He felt the steady rhythm of his own breathing, calm and controlled. The hunters had fallen into their own trap, not just of iron and rope, but of arrogance and greed. He turned away quietly, melting back into the forest. The mountains reclaimed their silence, and the night closed in, holding the men below in its cold, unyielding grip. Dawn crept into the Smoky Mountains slowly, as if the light itself hesitated to enter a place that had witnessed so much fear in the night. The fog thinned but did not disappear, lifting just enough to reveal the ravine where the hunters huddled, like broken remnants of their former selves. Cold clung to their bones. Pain pulsed through torn muscles and shattered confidence. The mountains stood silent above them, vast and indifferent, offering either comfort nor cruelty, only truth. The men did not rise with the sun. They lay where exhaustion had finally claimed them, bodies stiff, faces pale. When one stirred, it was with a groan, the sound of someone waking not from sleep but from shock. Another tried to stand and failed, collapsing back onto the damp earth, breath hissing through clenched teeth. Their rifles, once held with pride, lay scattered and useless, mud-caked and forgotten. Above them, unseen, he watched. He had not slept. He rarely did when strangers entered his territory. Instead, he perched on a high ledge, where the trees thinned and the wind carried every sound upward. From there, he observed the ravine, and the men trapped within it. He noted who still moved with strength and who no longer could. He counted again quietly, making sure none had slipped away during the night. They were all still there. The mountains felt different in daylight. Less threatening perhaps, but no less powerful. Sunlight filtered through the trees in pale beams, illuminating mist that drifted like smoke from an unseen fire. Birds returned cautiously, their calls tentative at first, then stronger as the morning stretched on. Life resumed, indifferent to the suffering below. The hunters slowly accepted what had happened. No one spoke of continuing the hunt. That idea had died somewhere in the fog, crushed under fear and pain. Now, their thoughts turned only to escape. They argued softly about direction, about who could walk and who needed help. Pride no longer fueled their voices. Survival did. One man, his leg badly injured, suggested leaving him behind so the others could move faster. The words fell heavily into the cold air. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. No one answered him right away. Eventually, another shook his head weakly. They would not leave anyone behind, he said, not after everything. It was a small gesture of humanity. But it came too late to restore what they had lost. From above, he listened without judgment. He did not hate them individually. Hatred took energy, and energy was precious. What he felt instead was distance. These men belonged to a world he had escaped, a world of ownership and cruelty disguised as order. That world had followed him into the mountains, and the mountains had rejected it. He waited until they began to move. Their progress was slow and painful. Every step was a negotiation with injury and fear. They leaned on one another, stumbling through terrain that refused to cooperate. Trails they believed would lead them out dissolved into nothing. Landmarks looked unfamiliar in the shifting light. The mountains had many ways of confusing those who did not belong. He guided them subtly, never appearing, never forcing. A broken branch pointed one way. A cleared patch of ground suggested a path. He led them away from his shelters, away from his stores, away from the deeper parts of his world. He wanted them gone, not dead. Death brought questions. Fear brought silence. Hours passed. Sweat mixed with blood and dirt. The hunters grew weaker, their movements mechanical. At one point, one man dropped his rifle into a stream and did not stop to retrieve it. The sound of it hitting water echoed briefly, then vanished. Another removed his knife and left it behind, too heavy to carry. Piece by piece, they shed the tools that had once made them feel powerful. As the sun climbed higher, the terrain softened slightly. The ravine widened, slopes became gentler, and the air felt less oppressive. They did not realize it, but they were nearing the edge of the mountains. Civilization waited beyond the trees, roads, towns, voices, and law. To them it represented safety. To him, it was a boundary he would not cross. When they finally reached a clearing where the forest thinned and the land leveled, the men stopped. Some fell to their knees. Others sat heavily on fallen logs, chests heaving. None of them spoke for a long moment. They simply breathed, letting the reality settle in. They had survived. One man turned slowly, scanning the trees behind them, his eyes hollow. "He let us go," he whispered, though he had no proof. No one argued. They all felt it, the same unspoken truth. Whatever had hunted them in the mountains had chosen mercy over blood. High above, concealed among branches and stone, he watched them leave. He stayed still until they were nothing more than shapes fading into distance, then until even those shapes vanished. Only when the last sound of their struggle was swallowed by the forest did he allow himself to relax. He exhaled deeply, a long breath he did not realize he had been holding. The mountains reclaimed their rhythm. Wind moved through the trees. A hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry slicing cleanly through the air. The forest did not remember fear for long. It absorbed it and moved on. He descended carefully, choosing paths no one else could follow. He passed places where traps still lay, now harmless and forgotten. He disarmed some, repurposed others. Nothing went to waste. The mountains demanded respect, and he honored that demand. At a hidden spring, he knelt and washed his hands, the cold water numbing his fingers. His reflection shimmered briefly on the surface. Older than his years, eyes steady, face shaped by hardship and endurance. He did not recognize the man he had once been on the plantation. That person belonged to a different life, a different name. Here, he was simply himself. He returned to his shelter as the day warmed, checking his stores, reinforcing walls, adjusting camouflage. Life continued. Survival did not pause for reflection. Yet as he worked, understanding settled within him. The hunters would tell stories. They would speak of fog, of traps, of a presence they never saw. Some would exaggerate. Others would swear never to return. Fear would spread, distorted but effective. And that was enough. He did not need glory. He did not need revenge. He needed distance. He needed the freedom to wake each morning without chains, to move where he wished, to exist beyond ownership. The mountains gave him that, and he would protect it with patience rather than rage. As evening approached once more, fog began its slow return, rolling into valleys and softening the edges of the world. He stood on a ridge and watched it rise, familiar and comforting. Somewhere beyond the peaks, men spoke his name, if they even knew it at all, as a warning. He turned away from the fading light and disappeared into the trees, becoming once again what he had chosen to be. Not a slave, not a ghost, but a free man shaped by the Smoky Mountains, written into their mist, their silence, and their enduring memory. He walked through the Smoky Mountains with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged entirely to the land. The air was crisp, tinged with the smell of damp earth and pine. The trees stretched overhead like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined to form natural arches. Every sound, the snap of a twig underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, was a language he understood completely. These mountains were not just a refuge, they were a living, breathing partner in his survival. Every ridge, every hidden path, every cave he had discovered over the years belonged to him, marked subtly but unmistakably by a presence the land itself seemed to recognize. The night after the hunters fled was still and almost reverent, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. He moved carefully, checking his surroundings, ensuring that nothing had been left behind, nothing disturbed. The traps the hunters had set were inspected, not to use them against anyone else, but to understand their intentions and mistakes. He studied the iron jaws, the snares and the pit traps, noting how poorly they had been made for someone truly familiar with the forest. It fascinated him, in a quiet, grim way, that they had believed mere steel could match knowledge honed by years of living within these hills. For a long while, he sat on a high ledge, gazing over the valleys that stretched endlessly before him. Mist curled around the peaks, drifting slowly into every hollow and over every slope, creating a world that seemed both infinite and intimate. He remembered the hunters, the fear in their voices, the injuries that had slowed them, the mistakes that had cost them their confidence. He felt no glee at their suffering, only a deep, quiet satisfaction that his freedom remained untouched. The mountains had protected him. His patience had protected him. The forest had done what no man could. It had turned predators into prey, but it had done so without spilling unnecessary blood. Days passed in a rhythm he had come to know well. He gathered water from hidden springs, washed in the cold streams, and fished in small pools. He hunted game carefully, taking only what he needed, leaving the forest as he found it. Each meal was earned, each moment of comfort hard-won, and yet there was a serenity in it, a quiet joy that could not be named. Here, in this isolation, he was more than a fugitive. He was a part of the mountains themselves, a silent shadow moving among the ridges, a ghost who had claimed his life back from the chains of men. The forest taught lessons daily. One afternoon he observed a bear moving through the underbrush, massive and slow but aware, every step deliberate. He watched with fear, noting the animal's method of approach, the way it sniffed the air, the subtle ways it adapted to the environment. Its presence reminded him that the world was governed not by men and their weapons, but by patience, understanding, and timing. The hunters had ignored this lesson. They had relied on force, speed, and arrogance. That was why they had failed. That was why he had survived. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he could hear faint voices from towns below, or distant roads where people moved unaware of the drama that had just unfolded in the mountains. The sound reminded him of another world, one he had left behind. He thought of the plantation, of the men and women who remained enslaved, and of the chains that had once bound him so tightly. Those memories no longer had power over him, but they fueled his caution. Freedom was fragile. It required constant vigilance. The mountains were vast, but they could not forgive carelessness. He maintained a network of shelters, hidden in caves or cleverly camouflaged under fallen trees and moss. Each one had a purpose. One for storage, one for rest, one as an observation point. He traveled between them silently, checking for signs of intrusion or damage. Everything he did was deliberate, a constant dance of preparation and awareness. The hunters might have left the mountains, but he knew others would come. The world beyond these peaks did not forget a man who had escaped. Money, revenge, curiosity, any of these could bring strangers into his home. He could not afford to be complacent. Despite this, he allowed himself moments of reflection. On ridges where the sun broke through the fog, painting the valleys in gold and blue, he felt a profound peace. He thought of the night the hunters had entered, of the fear they had carried with them, and the chaos they had caused, and he recognized the truth. The mountains had always been more than protection. They had been a teacher. Every step, every trap, every shadow had been a lesson in patience, strategy, and restraint. He had learned to anticipate, to observe, to respect both danger and opportunity. There were times when he would walk along narrow cliff paths, the wind whipping through his hair, and feel a connection to the past and the future simultaneously. He was a man shaped by cruelty, by escape, by endurance, yet he had forged something enduring here, freedom not just from chains, but from fear. The mountains demanded humility, and he had learned it. They demanded respect, and he had given it. Every echo, every rustle of leaves, every bird in flight reminded him that he was alive on his own terms. He often thought of the hunters, imagining their retreat to towns and villages, their stories told with exaggeration or fear, their own minds haunted by shadows that were no longer there. Perhaps they would warn others, perhaps their fear would spread. That was sufficient. He did not seek glory or recognition. What mattered was that he had lived, that he had preserved what no one could take from him: autonomy, awareness, and the hard-earned right to move freely through the land. Occasionally, he would leave subtle signs of his passage, marks that might be noticed by someone very skilled, someone observant enough to read the forest, but nothing that would invite pursuit. He understood that mystery was a tool as valuable as stealth or speed. He existed in the mountains not as a legend, but as a force in harmony with the land. The hunters had learned this too late. Others might never learn it at all, and that was the way it should be. Evenings brought a different kind of quiet. The fog returned, rolling gently into valleys and creeks, and the sounds of the forest softened. He would sit on a ledge or beneath the branches of an ancient oak, feeling the pulse of the mountains beneath him. The forest was not just a home. It was a companion, a silent witness to his life, a reminder that freedom required vigilance, patience, and respect. Here, he was more than a man. He was a part of the world that had once seemed impenetrable, now a partner in the ongoing struggle to survive on his own terms. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, he maintained the rhythm of life he had established. The hunters faded into memory, their presence a reminder of what could happen when arrogance met skill and knowledge. The mountains held no malice toward them, nor toward anyone else who wandered into their folds unprepared. But they rewarded the careful, the patient, the observant. And he had proven himself to be all of these things. With each passing day, he became not just a survivor, but a master of the world he had chosen, a man whose freedom was absolute because it was earned in silence, sweat, and shadow. Even when storms raged through the peaks, tearing branches from ancient trees and sending torrents of rain down the valleys, he adapted. He took shelter in hidden caves, reinforced by years of experience, and waited for the storm to pass. Each challenge, each trial strengthened him further. He was part of the mountains, shaped by their harshness, sustained by their secrets, and guided by their wisdom. In the quiet that followed, as fog rolled back over the valleys and the sun pierced through in golden rays, he moved through the forest again, a solitary figure among trees and shadows. The mountains stretched endlessly around him, vast, enduring, and full of mystery. He walked with purpose, alert to every sound and every movement, knowing that this land had given him everything he could claim: survival, understanding, and freedom. The hunters had come and gone, but he remained, a living testament to the power of patience, strategy, and the enduring spirit of a man who had learned to become one with the mountains. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, share happiness, and support us by subscribing to the channel and giving a like. Stay happy always. Thank you.